Hello, everybody, and welcome to CogX 2021. This is day 3, coming from the Everyman in King's Cross at the Matrix stage. There are talks, as you all know, across various locations at King's Cross. If you're watching online, hello and welcome to the global audience. There are a number of streams today, and we're going to kick off on this stage with something on the Planet and Smart City stage. It's going to be another broad-ranging set of discussions going throughout the day, everything from environment to ethics, well-being to economics. And I encourage you to dip in, dip out, both in real time if you are here and virtually if you are elsewhere. Please do remember a couple of things. The first is that you can enter questions for any of the sessions you hear via your Hopin app. If you're here in real life, it's the old-fashioned way of just putting your hands up. Please do tweet. We've got hashtag CogX 2021, where you can put your comments, your thoughts, kind of your questions about the whole festival. It's going to be a really interesting day on this stage today, but we're going to move pretty swiftly onto this talk. Before we get going, I'd quickly like to thank BT, Quantum Bank and Visa for their support of the festival, but in particular to Accenture, lead partner. And I'm just going to hand over to lead this talk to Lucy Cooper, who is Head of Innovation for the Europe Division of Accenture. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Joy. And welcome everyone back to being here in person. It's my first in-person session since the pandemic started, so a moment of optimism for us all. I'm joined this morning by Stuart Wood and Tom Elvidge. Stuart Wood is a partner at Heatherwick Studios. He has a background in industrial design, and he's led the broadest range of projects, and some of the most iconic projects for the studio. So Stuart's currently leading a diverse group of projects, including Google's 1 million square foot home in London, just around the corner, in collaboration with Big, and Lantern House, a 2-tower residential development that spans both sides of New York City's High Line, if anyone's familiar with that. One of my favorite buildings in the world, Stuart's responsible for the studio's Vessel, which is the Hudson Yards Manhattan West Side iconic building, as well as the conceptual design phases of Google's 2 new headquarters in California. So welcome, Stuart. And Tom Elvidge is the Senior Vice President for Vehicle Programming at Arrival. Tom joined in 2020 during the pandemic, so we'll hear a bit about that, after leading Uber in Leeds, Newcastle, then London, and then the whole of the UK and Ireland. Arrival uses revolutionary new methods of design, such as the Arrival Microfactory, which we'll talk a little bit about, to create electric vehicles that elevate the everyday, empower local communities, and unlock true sustainability to create radical impact. I'm Lucy Cooper, Head of Innovation for Europe for Accenture, looking after our 1,000-strong innovation practitioners, which we call Impactioneers, who lead innovation revolutions for our clients. So Tom and Stuart, welcome. This stage is the Planet stage, and we're here to talk about smart cities. And the IEA have just recently published a pretty groundbreaking report about how we get to net zero in 2050. And they made some striking recommendations about how to achieve that. And actually, the answer is, unsurprisingly, we sort of have to do everything, and we sort of have to do it quite quickly. Behavior change is going to be a really key part of this, as well as how governments step up to collaborate in the impact of the net zero goals. But one of the things that stood out the most was infrastructure and urban areas are going to be critical to playing a role in getting us there. For those of you who don't know, smart cities are cities that use data, IoT, and edge computing, as well as their fair share of artificial intelligence, to turbocharge an experience of a city to its citizens, the services it offers, the contribution the city makes, and essentially, well, the air we breathe, the buses we take, the walks we have, and the waste we use. So I'd like to start with both of you telling me a little bit, how do you define the scope of smart cities, and a little bit the role that Heatherwick and Arrival play in the delivery of smart cities? Stuart, let's start with you.
So I think the thing that I would say when I hear the word smart city is, I think of it firstly as a bit of a buzzword, but it's also perhaps a stand-in for the future. And what I mean by that is data, in my opinion, is fetishized. So access to data itself doesn't automatically equal a great anything. It doesn't necessarily mean a great experience. It certainly doesn't mean a great city. Of course, it can give you an insight into behavior and cause and effect, all of which is vital. And of course, environmental targets, in a way, they're non-negotiable. As you say, there's no option. We have no option but to change our ways in so many at so many levels. But the thing that we think a lot about at the studio and with our work with people like Google is actually about experience, collective experience, and lovability, you might say, which is the places and spaces and cities that I think most people love. They're very unsmart. There's no internet of anything. They have credentials that speak to human experience and a deeper sustainability, because there's a beauty, there's an efficiency, there's an elegance. And so I think just focusing on the smart bit will miss many other aspects of, frankly, what we all need to think about when we're trying to create and evolve collective living experiences.
Thank you. Tom?
Well, I guess, first of all, I to pick up on what you said, Stuart, I definitely agree that smart cities can sometimes be a bit of a placeholder for the future. And, my experience is in mobility and looking at what are the changes that are happening within cities in regard to mobility, what's the future of mobility. And if I think of, what makes a smart city in that regard, well, we were sort of promised this future that would be, autonomous vehicles, fully electric, connected devices. And whilst that technology exists, it's not, we're still some distance from getting there. So I think that's really the first thing. We're seeing these, specifically within mobility, the technology that is that is now being brought about is to enable vehicles that are autonomous eventually, fully electric, which is now almost goes without saying, really. That's the direction of travel, and devices that are sort of fully connected. And that means not only the vehicles themselves having the ability to talk to one another and to be to sort of pass data back to operators such as Uber and other ride-hailing companies, but also the components within those vehicles being connected so that you can have a radically extended lifespan of those vehicles through much more thoughtful upgrade of components. So I think that's sort of, on the one hand, what the technology is enabling. I think on the other side, the trends that we're seeing in regard to mobility for consumers is people, and cities for that matter, are wanting increased access of goods and services, and the ability to have a very high convenience service within cities that are, the infrastructure is not really changing that much. So that challenge is one that most cities now, major cities around the world, are sort of grappling with. How do we enable that service provision for consumers that is now becoming an expectation within infrastructure that is, by and large, not likely to change that much?
And you are tackling that a little bit with changing the infrastructure that you bring to a city with your micro factories, which is all about, the concept of placing dramatically smaller factories closer to the center of an urban area, and the huge impact that's going to have on local economies and sustainability. So tell us a little bit more about where the concept came from and why it's so important to the proposition of Arrival.
Sure. Maybe just to spend a minute on Arrival for anybody who's not familiar. We're a technology company. We're designing and developing commercial electric vehicles from scratch, from the ground up. So we're a company that is developing not only the vehicles themselves, but many of the components that go into those vehicles. In fact, about 2/3 by value of the vehicles we're making are fully designed and developed, whether it's the battery modules to the drive units to the composite materials that are used for the exterior of the vehicles. And Arrival has 3 products in development right now. We have an Arrival bus, a van, and just announced a month or so ago is what we call the Arrival car, which is a ride-hail specific vehicle, so purpose designed for an Uber driver or Lyft or Ola or equivalent. And the technology and approaches that Arrival takes are ones that can enable a micro factory. So what we mean by micro factory is something that is dramatically smaller than a traditional automotive manufacturing plant. It can be as small as 10,000 square meters. That's the target that we have for the 3 micro factories that are currently in development for the vehicles that we're making. We've got micro factories in an assembly stage right now, pre-production, both in the US and over here in the UK. And there's a number of reasons why the approach that Arrival takes can afford such a dramatically reduced footprint. But just one to touch on is the sort of structural exterior of the vehicle is made through a polypropylene glass fiber, so a composite material that replaces what has traditionally been a stamped steel. For many automotive manufacturers, when you're using a stamped steel, then you have very, very high tooling costs. The cost of the tools that go into making those components is so high that it really requires a very concentrated and very high volume production method. So just that technology change alone means that the tooling costs can be lower. The amount of tooling that is needed within those factories can be dramatically lower as well. So that sort of opens up the possibility of having many, many more factories that can be located very close to the center of demand. So we're now in a phase where we're looking at where do we want to deploy these micro factories, and that is of course based upon where do we see the demand for our products coming from, as well as other factors. So that is that sort of opens up a number of other benefits as well.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to that in a bit, but I want to talk a little bit about, Stuart, you used the phrase earlier, collective experience, and you said it's kind of really at the core of how Heatherwick thinks about design, and it's the sort of ultimate thread that brings together all of your projects. And you said to me yesterday, cities are the ultimate test of that, which I think is a really lovely sort of rhetorical question to pose. So tell us about some of the projects, that you're working on at the moment. I think you've got a couple of photos to show.
Well, I don't know whether it's possible to bring up there's a picture of a city shot, the last slide, I think. So this is a project that we're working on with Google at the moment, and this is a visualization of a piece of city in San Jose in California. And I think the first interesting thing to say about this is traditionally developers build pieces of city, governments build pieces of city, but we're now in a world where technologists such as Google have enough wherewithal, aspiration, and potential to create pieces of city. Now, some might find that anxiety-inducing, but I think our point of view is that by working with people such as Google, we've been allowed to explore and follow threads of thinking that have actually been shut down through traditional means of development. So, for example, you will never hear us or Google refer to this project as smart, ever. The word smart is almost banned, and yet they are technologists who develop significant amounts of connecting technology. And I think that's because the principles that we're getting at with this project, some might call the principles of the 15-minute city. In a way, they're simply you could say a return to values of city arrangements half a century ago, where your world was within reach, your community, your education, your place of work, your access to nature. And so a big part of this has actually been about the slowing down pace in a way, not emphasizing the car. Not that there's anything wrong with the car, we're actually designing a car as well, but focusing on the human being. And once you slow down pace and arrange cities with that level of access and mix, suddenly experience comes to the fore. And the speed of the city allows and affords a level of change and dynamism and grain that we would argue is vastly needed. And then I think the last part is trying to find what is specific about a location. The climate of San Jose is obviously completely different to the climate of London. And so trying to tap into those climatic drivers as well and drive experience beneficially through that. So I think for us, in a way, all we're ever thinking about is experience. Form and shape and color and materials, of course, that comes into it, but we're trying to actually think about emotional experience, the experience of memory, the experience of what I perhaps amusingly called lovability earlier. You could put different words in there, but we're trying to create resonance and sort of adherence in a way to a place to make you care about it, so that you live there, stay there, and do what you need to do there. So a lot of our conversations on this project have actually been through that lens of experience, less so technology or structural engineering, even though all those things are all, of course, all there. So those are some of the values that we've been digging into quite deeply.
And how do you think the pandemic is changing experience, right? So when I was listening to you talk, I was just thinking of sentimentality, right? You want people to feel sentimental about where they are. I mean, we had a comment earlier that one of these slides looks like King's Cross, which is where we are today. And you said, no, that's San Jose. But I can see, looking at the picture, there are some, that it does resemble, the area that we've walked through this morning. How important is the pandemic in shifting the way people are going to experience? I mean, we know it's dramatically shifted the data you look at, like people moving out of cities, the hybrid working, and people saying, actually, I don't need to live near a tube station necessarily. There is another way for me to live my life. How has that trickled down into the work that you do in the studios?
Well, I think as we've all read and seen, there have been many, many articles about the reflection on the workplace. And it took the arc of, we don't need the workplace. Everything's great on Zoom. And then everyone realizing everything wasn't okay on Zoom, and we do need the workplace. So I think part one is, in our experience, rethinking of the workplace as a confirmation of the values of an organization and enabling social interaction, quite simply. And recognizing that you can do many things on Zoom, but there are some things you just can't do. Tom and I were talking earlier about designing. You can do it on Zoom. It's a social experience. Fundamentally, it's a physical social experience. But I think part two of our observation, and in a way this has been swelling up almost as an indignance, which is, because we've all been sat at home, the tolerance for poor placemaking or poorly thought through public space, I would say, has lowered. And the expectation and the objective need for high quality, thoughtful, compelling public space, which isn't just parks and plazas, it's everything the moment you leave your front door. I think it's awakened all of our collective expectation of why go outdoors, and if I go outdoors, it better be damn good, rather than just shrugging your shoulders and thinking, well, I guess that's okay, it's a shiny building and some nice stone over there. There's actually a need for thoughtful, proactive public space. So I think those two things together mean, if you're going to leave your home and leave Zoom, it better be worthwhile. And I think that's a really motivating thing. I don't mean that sarcastically. I think that's extremely motivating for commissioners of buildings and public space, and for designers and architects of public space.
Exciting time for you. Tom, Arrival's obviously going through a massive sort of growth phase at the moment, where your ambition is getting people out of private cars and into other modes of transports. How do you make a decision to move on a certain part of your strategy? What are you looking at? What are you listening out for that's helping you and the leadership make those decisions?
There's a few things. I think maybe the first one to touch on is Arrival sort of deliberately focused on the commercial vehicle sector as one to start designing and developing EVs in. And that's because, traditionally it's been a sector that's perhaps been a little bit underserved by other EV manufacturers, first of all. So there's an opportunity there and a requirement. But secondly, it's an area that has perhaps a bit more rationality in the way that purchase decisions are made. And that is to say, if an electric van, such as the one that Arrival offers, can be more affordable to run than a diesel equivalent, then the organizations like, for example, UPS, who we've been working very closely with in partnership on the development of this, it's a no-brainer decision for them to make. So that has been a really interesting area for us to look at. And I think the other thing that comes into this is for cities who are looking to get to net zero, for the electrification of a vehicle like a van, it's one that can have a very standard daily or weekly range requirement versus a personal vehicle. As we've heard, it's been commented on many times, where people sort of typically think about buying an EV for the range requirement for the trip that they maybe make once or twice a year, where they need to go 250 miles, for example. And actually for a van, it's very easy to predict the number of miles that a UPS driver needs to do the following day. So it allows the affordability of the vehicle and the components that are required, in particular the battery modules that are by far the most expensive component in the vehicle, to be very neatly selected for the use case. So that's one thing that has been sort of central to what we're doing. And the bus, the van, and the car for ride hailing have all followed that approach. And then maybe the second thing to touch on is, from a sort of industrial design and user experience perspective, the vehicles that Arrival develops are seeking to really elevate the experience for all stakeholders. So if we take the bus as an example, that is a product that's been, of course, designed with the driver and the passengers in mind. But it's not only that, it's also all the other citizens who are interacting with the bus, even if you're not getting on and off it. There are cyclists and pedestrians and other road users. So we have a very strong industrial design and experience team who are looking at this from every angle and every use case to really understand what is it that experience offers today, and how can we look for opportunities to really radically improve that for everybody interacting with those products.
You mentioned, for commercial use and companies looking to get to net zero, a big part of getting to net zero is coming from, yes, putting batteries in electric cars, but then the batteries being manufactured sustainably. So that the sites are not run off of coal-powered machinery and, all the way back to the source. I guess a question for both of you: how do you think about circular, production and regenerative sort of design? How much is that at the forefront of how you're both making your projects and your products and your experiences? Because a lot of the end users want, go forth and say they want to, experience something sustainable or buy something sustainable. But actually, it's quite often up to the corporates that sit in the middle to make sure that all the back end of the value chain is as circular and regenerative as possible. So tell me a little bit about kind of your experience with that.
Well, maybe if I jump in on that one, it's interesting in the world of architecture, because of course buildings are incredible. They're incredible users of energy, the energy footprint from the production, the fabrication, and of course the long-term use. And tying back to this point earlier about data, so much of the sustainability and circular discussion of buildings is about the data of the embodied energy, the data of the usage of energy. But actually, what we've found in looking at cities is you could argue, some of the most sustainable, lowest energy footprint buildings are some of the things the Victorians gave us. And that's not because they're wonderfully insulated or have photovoltaic cells on the roof. They don't. But they're so fundamentally well built and have a flexibility. And in fact, there are examples around us where the ability to repurpose them thoughtfully gives them a long life, a long, long life, because the act of taking a building down is incredibly energy intensive, even if you can repurpose or reuse or melt down the component pieces. So I think sustainability should and can be looked at from both a long-term repurposing use point of view, as well as, of course, the individual elements or the footprint or the reusability. And I think that's something that, again, for us isn't a sort of misty-eyed romantic view. It's a very practical observation. And that doesn't mean all buildings can achieve this, but there are many examples of architecture, not necessarily around here, but in places we've all been to and seen, where you can see that there's a cynical gesture of efficiency and energy minimizing, but actually that building won't be around for very long, because it will be taken down because it's just not very nice, or it's just not going to last. And so for us, that's a very important thing to question, is looking at it from those different vantage points.
Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I think similarly, in regard to a well-designed building lasting for a long, long time, the same is true for vehicles. And with the vehicles that we're making, we want these to be on the street for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of miles. And again, going back to the sort of commercial vehicle sector, one of the things that's really attractive about that is, we want our products, of course, to be well-designed, functional, usable, and beautiful products, but they are fundamentally a business tool. So therefore, the potential to radically extend the life of the vehicle, if that is still usable, functional, and performing as well as it was on day one, the decision to keep it running is clear. So we approach that angle from the perspective that every component, every panel, every single part of the vehicle that can be replaced and upgraded should be. And how do we do that in a way that can make it as simple and straightforward for the owners of the vehicle as well? So if we take the arrival car as an example, that it'll be the purchase decision for that vehicle will be made by the ride-hail driver predominantly, and we're looking at are there ways that the parts that would be sort of high wear, whether it's the exterior sills or even inside the door handles, for example, can we offer a solution that those parts can be ordered very easily, through a customer app where you can order the part, have it shipped direct to the owner, and then through simple instructions, that part could be upgraded. And that can only be possible through the design of the vehicle setting out with that objective from day one. So the ability to then really extend the life of the vehicle can be opened up. We're also just looking at how do we have components in the vehicles that can be sustainable. So for example, the composite that I mentioned that we use for the exterior, that's a replacement for steel in many cases, that starts life as a fabric, goes through a process that turns it into a hard material used for the panels, but that is 100% recyclable. So any offcuts that are made at the start of the design or the start of the manufacture process can be fed right back in at the start, and indeed anything that comes out of the end of that can be reused as well. So the potential for that, from a material with those sort of properties, it's can be really transformative.
Okay, I've got a couple more questions. There's a couple that's coming online, and I don't know if there's any in the room. So maybe there'll be a roving mic in case people want to put their hands up now if you have a question, and then I'll come back to you in a second. I want to talk about collaboration and partnership. Like you both talk about smart being a sort of placeholder for the future. I think it's becoming more and more evident you can't get to the future alone. You have to have partnerships, and they're absolutely key. So, Tom, you've talked about UPS, you've talked about the car you've created being actually made for ride sharing. Tell us how the approach to partnerships is helping the arrival strategy. And then, Stuart, I'll come to you because you've also mentioned, Google getting involved in building cities, and I'm interested in the view of how that works.
Sure. So, yeah, as you mentioned, we've got really strong collaborations for each of our products with a number of partners. We have UPS with the van is probably the best example. We've been working with UPS now for over 3 years in the development of that product. And fundamentally, it's about how do we design, develop something that really squarely meets the needs of the drivers who are using that vehicle for 8+ hours per day. So how do we get the ergonomics, the usability of the vehicle working effectively? For the car, we announced that we're working with Uber in the design and development on that similarly, so that we have a product ultimately that just really meets the needs of drivers. And that's core to the way that we work. We're a relatively young company, so we want to ensure that when we do bring a product to market with all of the, it's a radically reduced time frame to bring the product to market, but it's still a multi-year program, so it needs to meet the needs of the end users through those collaborations.
Stuart?
Well, I think quite simply, we can't do anything without collaboration. Certainly once you get to the scale of a building, let alone the scale of a car or a product, buildings are momentous pieces of collaboration. So when you get to the scale of a city, in a way, we're simply the agent of communication and interpretation, you might say. So with the project on screen at the moment, the proudest collaboration I would say there is with the local population. 2.5 years of deep consultation, not with complete sort of blank canvas, but creating structured discussions to really deeply understand what does make this community tick, what would answer their needs, what would their vision of the future look like for them. And sometimes that's a call and response. But I think we would never be so arrogant as to say we have all the answers, we know what the smart city of the future should be, because there are examples of that in history, recent history, and you're inevitably going to fail because it's a fixed point in time from a small group of thinkers. So I think collaboration it's non-negotiable, it's utterly essential, certainly in the world that we live in. And then at a design, engineering, technical level, if I don't know whether you could go to the image of the car that we're working on. So we're not car designers by training, and we're not designing the number of complex vehicles that Tom and his teams are working on. But our thinking with this concept, which is now going to go into production, was to not necessarily think of it like a car, even though we hope it looks nice and it has an interesting look and feel, but it was actually to think of it in the context of the city. So this project for us has two key ideas in it. One is very much about not just not doing harm with regards to being electrically powered and clean electricity, but the question of could we go further than that and implement air cleaning technology that basically turns each car into a hoover or a cleaner of the air around it, low-level particles, brake dust, and so on. And so we thought that was a pretty interesting provocation to try and flip the car from being something that doesn't just do no harm, but it becomes a proactive good. And then the other aspect of it, which is, I think, the point you were touching upon, which is utilization. Most private vehicles spend 90+% of their time sat doing nothing, which is kind of crazy, a piece of decaying technology. And so we try to think of this as an extension of people's lives, so an extension of their home space, for it to become workspace or recreational space, dining space, etc. And so wrapping that back to your collaboration question, the most useful thing for us was having a deep collaboration with the potential users of this project and the user groups and the age groups, and getting an insight into their minds of how do they think of the world of transport, because it's totally different to the way I think of it or the way my dad thinks of it. And they simply see it as a utility and a piece of their life as opposed to a piece of sexy transport. So I think that was really insightful for us to derive these other ways to look at it.
We've got a question here saying, do you agree that it's important to talk about smart places, as most of the world's population do not live in cities? How do you think about that, Stuart?
Well, again, I think it comes back to my earlier point, which is I think smart is in a way is the wrong focus. I think technology and data will and can leverage good in terms of fundamental connectivity and access to supply and demand. But in a way, what we're focused on are you could say, very, very well-established traditional motifs that have arguably been forgotten in the act of rapid development, which is a return to those more local values and more socially connected values. And I think you can explore and deploy those in rural settings, remote settings, and of course, the incredible test of the dense urban setting. So I don't think of them as urban versus suburban. I don't subscribe to that belief. I think they're core human values that you can expand upon depending on density and location.
Are there any questions? Yeah, one down here. Yeah, just shout. Down the front here, lady in the...
Thank you. So this follows on actually from the one that you had on the iPad there. The typical vision that we see for future cities is expansive and spacious. How do you consider minimizing the physical land footprint of humans containing urban sprawl, especially where they happen to abut fragile ecosystems, particularly in rapidly developing economies?
I think you touched on one of those, which is the utilization. You know, if I think of the vehicles that are used in a city, take London as an example, it's sort of an astonishing fact, but there are still almost half of journeys done in London of one person in a private car driving themselves around. How do we change that? You know, the first thing that we need to think about is what is the experience, or one of the first things is, what is the experience of being on public transport? How do we elevate that experience so it doesn't feel like there's a trade-off to be made if you're taking the bus or if you're taking the tube versus driving in your own car? And that is not an easy challenge to overcome, because right now the difference is fairly stark in many cases, but it's not insurmountable. And you know, the bus is just a really effective way of getting a bunch of people from A to B within a city. So that vehicle can open up an enormous amount of utilization opportunity if it's done really, really well over time. And if we think, you know, many years into the future, you can imagine an experience that is sort of pretty far superior to the one that we're offered today within cities. So I think that can have a pretty transformative effect with the way that, you know, we have the sort of combination of vehicles on roads versus residential areas versus, you know, space for relaxation. That balance has probably got a little bit out of skew in many cities, it's fair to say. So that's, you know, one opportunity that I see.
Yeah, I would double down on that, and this is something we've looked at a lot, which is if you take the cross section of a typical residential street or an inner city street, a huge amount of that distance is provisioned for cars, and the offsets that the car and then the parking of the car and then the pavement adjacent to the car creates pushes buildings further apart, pushes people upwards in buildings, not outwards and downwards. And the cause and effect of that en masse is a huge amount of spread and distancing, which I think we again would argue creates dislocation. So some of the more provocative ideas, which are certainly being discussed, is the idea of urban arrangements where the car stops at the outskirts and then you transition to other lighter, more mass transit means. And the advent of cheap electric motors is obviously creating an explosion of possibility there. But urbanistically, it allows you to pull buildings down closer together and pull people outdoors and reconnect, rather than a sea of tarmac with moments of green that you're thankful for. It's flipping that equation and saying, no, you need to demonstrate to me why this shouldn't be green or shouldn't be human pedestrian focused. And I think it's easy to say, but I think if you take that seriously, you can have some really quite thoughtful and profound effects, rather than just accepting the norms of, as you say, sprawl and distance and separation.
It's quite a good lead into another question here, and in the interest of time, probably our last one. Talking about how can we re-galvanize the role of government into supporting these kinds of visions and these, you know, sorts of futures. They gave the example here of DARPA helping inventing the internet. You know, how can we sort of galvanize that involvement from the government? Maybe a couple of comments from each of you before we close.
One thing that I would say is, when we consider smart cities, is it's often too easy to think of this sort of homogenous vision of the future. Cities are by definition unique, and some of the challenges they share, but the solutions that are required in cities are often going to be quite bespoke to every city around the world. And that's where the role of government can be so important. I think they can really help to understand what are the combination of top-down policies with collaboration from, you know, many organizations, but what are the sort of top-down approaches that can help within their city, and what are the bottom-up requirements that are coming from communities as well. And that role, there's no one else who can really do that. You know, that's where I think there's the most value to be added.
And again, I would relate to that. I had an amazing discussion with someone yesterday who's leads one of the world's biggest train manufacturing companies, and we were talking to him about what is the barrier to innovation, hydrogen-powered trains, whatever it might be. And it's it's so often really dumb, straightforward things like procurement, the economic structures of that cut off a deep innovation or a long-term innovation versus a bottom line driven approach that repeats the past. And as you say, only government can really flip that value equation and look at it in a longer term payoff, which might be more costly in the short term, but more beneficial, maybe cheaper, maybe not, in the long term. And I think only by breaking some of those static models will you get innovation into the building sector or the transport sector. It's super complex. Design, the one thing I have learned is design can do a lot of things. Design can't upend those deep economic structures. You can only partner and advocate with people in government or commissioning bodies.
Stuart and Tom, thank you so much for the fascinating conversation this morning. Joy.
And thank you very much to Lucy for hosting such a discussion, which I think kind of touched on questions of how we live. It was quite profound. If you are staying with us in this space, our next talk here is part of the Startup to IPO strand, and it's the question, is this the year of deep tech? Do have a break, do have a coffee, and see you back shortly for the next session. Thank you.